What we're about to look at is exactly the type of thing that might start to annoy a jury, and I have to imagine that the judge is pretty annoyed by all of these people at this point. And I mentioned this on Friday because at the end of the week, the Wayfarer parties put out a letter showing how ridiculous some of the exhibits Blake Lively was trying to drop on them at the last minute were, one of them being a Taylor Swift cookie recipe. So here's where we started in this feud over the Taylor Swift cookie recipe. They were talking about how Lively was dropping these exhibits, things that appeared to be mostly irrelevant or inadmissible, on them at the 11th hour. And the Wayfarer parties wrote, Lively also provided additional materials this morning, which her counsel explained after inquiry are intended to be revisions or additional components of previously identified exhibits, meaning that she had revised or added additional parts to exhibits she had previously identified. They go on to write here, these two appear to be of limited relevance or practical value. For instance, they include an article about a Taylor Swift cookie recipe that was linked in other correspondence. It is exceptionally unlikely Lively would show such materials or that the jury would gain any insight from them. So she had previously identified the correspondence as an exhibit, but then decided to add the article that had been linked inside of that correspondence. That's what the Wayfarer party said in their letter to the judge. And they were asking the judge for an additional week to note objections to the 68 new exhibits or parts of exhibits that she had identified only that morning, and to prepare any additional motions to potentially exclude that evidence accordingly. She has a huge exhibit list. They had a lot of motions due that day, and she was dropping things on them that morning. So they're saying they believe it would be reasonable to give them an extension on those newly dropped exhibits. Blake Lively and her attorneys have, of course, responded objecting to this extension, and it appears we're trying to make a full-fledged food fight out of this cookie recipe. And since I covered the Wayfarer side of this issue, I will cover the response. However, this is the type of kind of petty, stupid thing that will make the jury think this is ridiculous celebrity drama. Why are we here? So I think they need to get a little more selective in their outrage and what they want to have fights over come trial. I'm not even going to read the whole letter here because this is just getting tiresome. Let's just read this part. Defendant's assertion that Ms. Lively has loaded up the exhibit list with irrelevant documents is yet another press stunt. Defendants understand that any reference to Taylor Swift in their court filings leads to immediate headlines. Hence their claim that it is exceptionally unlikely that a jury would gain any insight from, and there's an exhibit number, which is an article about a Taylor Swift cookie recipe. Defendants conveniently omit that TAG emailed a link to that cookie recipe article to the Daily Mail, which TAG did to encourage one of its friendlies to trash Miss Lively in a way that would appear organic. As Miss Lively has previously explained, on August 15th, to stop the Daily Mail from writing about HR complaints, TAG provided a Daily Mail reporter with helpful links comparing Lively to Taylor Swift and urged the reporter to cover how Lively is emulating her best friend Taylor with the charm bracelets and shit, which which Nathan said was the only thing she could think of that looked organic and wouldn't seem like we placed. The Daily Mail published a few days later incorporating the provided links and quoting an insider that Lively laughed at the concept of making herself available to domestic violence survivors, is trying to get Taylor to help pull her out of this mess by using their friendship for interviews and other promotional work directly related to the film amid the current backlash that she is getting, and that the entire situation showed how out of touch she is. Thus, the cookie recipe article that defendants mock is actually something they made relevant when TAG sent it to the Daily Mail to influence that friendly publication to publish a hit piece about Miss Lively that would appear to be organic. And then they footnote an article here. It says, how Blake Lively copied best friend Taylor Swift to promote It Ends With Us. And they quote, in addition, Blake posted multiple videos of herself and her castmates baking while promoting the flick, which is a hobby that Taylor often uses when she promotes her own projects. So there's a lot to unpack here, but let me start by including a Taylor Swift cookie recipe in your exhibits to be shown to a jury is absolutely something that should be mocked. I'm not going to concede on that. Second, there's a reason I wanted to go through the Wayfarer letter, or that part of the Wayfarer letter, before we looked at this one, and it's because they clearly identified that this Taylor Swift cookie recipe was an additional component to an exhibit she had already identified. So the exhibit is the correspondence between TAG and Daily Mail, wherein they had linked this Taylor Swift cookie recipe. But as Lively's trial strategy seems to be to try to bury her opponent in exhibits, they're just adding random shit that doesn't need to be added, like additionally adding the cookie recipe itself as an exhibit for them to go over, again, at the 11th hour. So Lively's attorneys right here, defendants conveniently omit that Tag emailed a link to that cookie recipe article to Daily Mail, which Tag did to encourage one of its friendlies to trash Miss Lively. They actually didn't omit that. To be sure, we can look at this one more time where the Wayfarer parties wrote, Lively also provided additional materials this morning, which her counsel explained after inquiry are intended to be revisions or additional components of previously identified exhibits. For instance, they include an article about a Taylor Swift cookie recipe that was linked in other correspondence. So no, they actually didn't leave anything out there. The problem is it's just ridiculous no matter which way you spin it. So back to this letter from Lively's attorneys, they signal here that on August 15th to stop the Daily Mail from writing about HR complaints, and that's why Tag was talking to them about this Taylor Swift stuff. Here's the problem with that. There were no HR complaints. That's been confirmed multiple times. This signaled to the Wayfarer parties that they were going to need to defend themselves, and they did so by providing this reporter with information that was either factual or reasonably a matter of opinion based on their experience with Blake Lively. Now, when you think smear campaign, people think untrue or false information about somebody is being spread to ruin their reputation. This link between Blake Lively and Taylor Swift and how Blake Lively was kind of emulating Taylor Swift in a lot of ways and name-dropping her several times in relation to the film and her promotion of it, that's factual. And here's where I think Blake Lively is going to lose a lot of sympathy from any jury on this smear campaign retaliation claim. The things that the Wayfarer parties are saying about her, they can either prove or they can show why they felt the way they felt. When they're talking to this reporter, they're showing their work. They didn't just invent this out of thin air. Now, I certainly don't think it's a good thing that Tag was giving this to a Daily Mail reporter because I think they weren't supposed to say anything negative about her. However, at this point, it does seem that they had to turn to a defensive position because news outlets were starting to pick up on what Blake was selling about Justin behind the scenes, and they had every right to defend themselves from that. I do think that Tag pushed the boundaries of what the client wanted a couple of times from what we've seen in Justin's deposition and what was read to him and this here, but by all accounts, that does not seem to be illegal. Also, making an HR complaint about what you perceive to be sexual harassment would be protected activity. Blasting someone in the press, that's not a protected activity. They're allowed to defend themselves from that. Especially if the things Blake Lively is starting to sell to the press are untrue, like that there were HR complaints, which there were not. The closest thing to an HR complaint was Blake Lively making them sign that 17-point list, which by all accounts they seem to have done under duress. But this type of petty argument and the fact that they can show that Blake Lively is the one who named Taylor Swift in disclosures for this lawsuit, this is not something that's going to garner any kind of sympathy from the everyday New Yorker who's now going to be forced to take time out of their life and away from their job and to get paid very little to sit on a jury for however long this trial lasts so that rich people can fight over comparisons to Taylor Swift and whether or not that should get one of them millions and millions more dollars in damages. Like, that's just stupid. I mean, there's pages and pages of this like petty arguing about extension stuff between the parties, and the judge is going to take one look at that, and he's either going to say yes or no. So there's really no point in delving into that too much. The gist of a lot of what they were writing there is that the Wayfarer parties are being hypocritical, saying that the Wayfarer parties also added evidence at the last minute. She says they're stalling and misrepresenting facts and asking for things that aren't legally required. She says that her 814 exhibits are like 1% or less than 1% of everything that came out in discovery, and that the law doesn't require them to give like specific timestamps for the video evidence they're using in exhibits, which the Wayfarer parties were saying that she should be providing. Look, I do not envy the judge on having to deal with this shit in addition to the other cases that he's presiding over. You guys will have to let me know what you think in the comments below. I am going to share a link in the comments to my trial fundraiser. Thank you to everyone who's contributed so far. I really appreciate that. But that's all I got for now. So thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button for me. It helps me out a lot. And I'll see you all soon. Bye.